Okay, we're going to talk about domain and range. Domain are basically the x values that any graph covers. So how far does the graph go left and right? Range, what y values does that graph cover? How far does the graph go up and down? A lot of the times you're going to be using infinity on one end or the other. Without looking at the graph, if I'm looking algebraically, there's only one thing you can never divide by, which is 0. So if I figure that out, what value would give me 0? X squared minus 4 equals 0. If I add 4, x squared equals 4, and then x equals plus or minus the square root of 4, which is plus or minus 2. So I can have any x value as long as it is not equal to plus or minus 2, because that would give me a 0, which would make an undefined function. The way I list this, there's a few different ways to list it. In fancy brackets, we say all values of x such that x does not equal positive negative 2. Okay, that vertical bar is such that. So x such that x does not equal plus or minus 2. If I look at the square root, you cannot take the square root of anything negative. So anything underneath the square root has to be greater than or equal to 0. So x plus 1 greater than or equal to 0. X has to be greater than or equal to 1. So I would say fancy brackets, x, all x such that x greater than or equal to 1. If I'm giving a set of points, and I talk about domain, well, domain are my x values, so I'm only going to pick out my x values in here. I'm going to list them as a set of numbers, negative 3, negative 1, 0, 2, and 4. My range, I'm going to pick out all my y values. I'm going to list them as a set of numbers. So 0, 4. I don't need to list 2 twice, so I just need to list it once along with negative 1. And that should have ended with a fancy bracket. Most of the time when you're looking for domain and range, you're going to be looking at the graph. So if I go to my graph, I'm going to see that it is an upside down parabola. Domain left and right, this is going to keep getting wider and wider, so my domain is infinite. My range, however, does have a point that it stops at. It goes down infinitely, but it doesn't go up infinitely. So I really need to figure out where this point is. So I'm going to go to second, trace. Since that is a top point, that's called a maximum. I'm going to find the maximum. And I've got to tell the calculator to find the maximum point between where and where. So my left bound, make sure you're to the left of the maximum. Arrow over. Make sure you're to the right of the maximum. On the newer calculators, you get lines. Make sure your maximum is in between those lines. Press enter one more time, and I get my maximum. My y value for my maximum is 6.3 repeating. My domain for this function is going to be negative infinity to positive infinity. You always want to go least to greatest. My range, least, would be negative infinity to the top, which is 6.33 repeating. Since it does include 6.33, I am going to replace that with a bracket. Infinities always get parentheses. Sometimes the points get brackets. Okay, if I look at this function in the calculator, 1 over x plus 5, look at the graph of it, I see that I at least have a horizontal asymptote and I have a vertical asymptote, so some funny things are going to start happening. For my domain, left and right seem to be going, let's hit trace and test some points. So I do have a point at 0 and 1/5. What about at negative 3? I've got a point. Let's keep going over. I've still got a point, It looks like it might be breaking at -5. So what happens when I put in -5? Nothing. This cannot be included in your domain. Then if I look at my range, range is a little easier to see if you look at your table. We know this happens in the negative range. Here was my horizontal asymptote. My y values are going to keep going. And actually, that's going to be my only error. So my y will never be 0. And you see that's where the error happens between -1 and 1. My x will never be -5. So when I write this, I'm going to write my domain is all values of x such that x does not equal -5. And I write my range, it's going to be all values of y such that y does not equal 0.